Okay, so today is a very important day in the Chabad calendar because it's the yard side of the previous Rebbe, and it's the day, of course, that the following year the Rebbe took on the leadership of the movement. And so it's on a day like today, there's no question that we had to take this mimer, which is a pivotal mimer and essential for every Chabadnik. And so on a day like today, there's no question that we had to focus on this. Second. So what's the thing? Let's go back a little bit. So of course, the previous Rebbe came to the United States in 1941. He was in extremely ill health. He had multiple sclerosis, which was getting worse. And despite the fact that he was in bad health, and in fact, there were people who offered him the ability to be able to settle down in a small town in New Jersey, to be able to sit, study, and pray for the rest of his life. They were going to take care of him. And the previous Rebbe was so upset about that. This is the first night he spent in the United States. He spent the entire night crying. This was the attitude was, okay, Rebbe, you've done wonderful. Of course, the background, we need to take an even further step behind that. He had taken over the leadership after his father passed away in 1917. And the timing, of course, was atrocious. This was among the most difficult times for the Jewish people in general. The aftermath of World War I leading into, of course, the revolution in Russia and followed with the communist purges. And the previous Rebbe's leadership began in fire, completely under fire, with the communists taking over and banning religion. And so his entire experience as a leader had been under fire, first in the Soviet Union. Eventually he was arrested, actually several times, and thrown into prison, sentenced to death in 1947. Despite that he was sentenced to death, of course, he was freed miraculously. We can't really give any logical reason. There were political things going on, but the fact of the matter was, it was remarkable. And then he went from there to Riga, Latvia. He was building up the yeshiva there, and World War II starts moving in. And at the beginning of World War II, the previous Rebbe is in Warsaw, Poland. And so this is obviously not a great place to be, to say the least. He was there for the bombing of Warsaw, and he himself is actually rescued by members of the Nazi party. Interestingly enough, it's a fascinating story. There are several books written on it. The Chassidim in the United States managed to get through to Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State, who actually was an anti-Semite himself. But despite the fact that he was an anti-Semite, he wanted to curry favor with certain political figures. I'm not sure exactly why things happen, because sometimes we can only say it's a massive miracle. But the fact of the matter is that he reached out to Wilhelm Canaris, who was the head of the Abwehr, which is basically like the Nazi CIA. And Canaris wanted to keep the Americans out of the war, so he agreed to rescue the previous Rebbe with all of his family. And so you can imagine being in Warsaw at the time, and these Nazi soldiers are coming through trying to find the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And obviously they were hiding him, but somehow the Chassidim in New York managed to get through the message that these people who are Nazis are actually trying to save you. And man by the name of Ernest Bloch, who himself, his father was Jewish. He was not Jewish, but his father brought the Rebbe and his entire family to neutral Sweden. From there, they go to the United States. And like I said, in the United States, things were not exactly easy, but you can imagine after all that, the Chassidim in the United States were like, okay, Rebbe, just relax. And the Rebbe was saying, no, we need to rebuild Judaism right here and right now. And we need to build everything up. And he immediately began the yeshiva in the United States and started pushing Judaism out, all sorts of projects in order to be able to rebuild Judaism in the United States. The disease got worse and worse over those last 10 years of his life. And at a certain point, he was no longer able to understood when he was speaking. Only his closest secretaries, his family would lean in and try to convey whatever he was trying to say, because it was extremely difficult to be able to understand him because of the multiple sclerosis, of the advancing of the disease. So towards the end of his life, they changed the system in order to be able to deliver the Rebbe's words to people. They would go back into the archives and get Maimarim that the previous Rebbe had said in the past. The previous Rebbe would choose which Maimarim would be printed, and they would print them refreshed, so to speak, brought out from the past. Of course, we got to remember that in the 20s and 30s, not everything was actually printed. So these things were really new for the Chassidim at the time. There were very few people who had been there when the previous Rebbe had said the words in the first place. And so it was very, very much new. But oftentimes the previous Rebbe would tell them to change one thing or the other. So things would go either for a Shabbos or for a special date. So the 10th of Shvat was coming up. The 10th of Shvat is the yahrzeit of the previous Rebbe's grandmother, Rebbetzin Rivka. And the previous Rebbe told his son, who of course we know as the Rebbe, and then he was known as the Ramash, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson. He told him to pull out a certain mimer. This mimer began with the words, Be'etzam hayom hazeh yatzu tzivos Hashem me'eretz Mitzrayim, from last week's parsha. And he told him to take out this mimer and to print it. But he told him, delete the first paragraph and other small changes in the rest of the mimer. This original mimer had been said in 1923, excuse me. Legend has it that this was the first time, and I said legend just because I haven't looked it up myself, and I heard this from somebody recently, but I haven't looked it up myself. This mimer is actually from the first time our Rebbe met his father-in-law. And this mimer was supposed to be printed for that Shabbos. And he told him, delete the first paragraph. And instead of starting with the words Vahi be'etzam hayom hazeh, instead start with the words Basi Lgani achoisi kala, which is a pasuk from Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs. Well, that's where we're going to start from, and the mimer will go from there. And like I said, I think there were several other changes. Go ahead, Robert. Mute. Unmute.
Okay, I got it. Yeah. I'm doing right. So I've got the link, and so we're going to do the first grouping of them, which would be all 20. So we're going to deal with Basi Lgani and all 21 chapters of it. So I just want to know what I should be reading or what I should be downloading and printing for reference. So just let me know what's the sequence, because I see there's two groupings of them. Yeah. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
First, we're going to start with chapter 1 through 5. And
okay.
We'll start a group, if we want to continue the conversation.
Okay, great.
Go from there. You know, it's what's called a hemshech. A hemshech is a continuation of several maimarim, and lends to a full picture, and we can certainly do that. I was thinking about something else, but that's perfectly fine. It doesn't. This is.
Okay, so right. So the first one is Shir HaShirim 5:1. I got it. Thank you.
Absolutely. So then Friday morning, Shabbos morning, the previous Rebbe passes away on the 10th of Shvat. And, you know, you got to remember that Chabad in the United States at the time was very small in terms of what you had in New York. You had a lot of people who the previous Rebbe had impacted. You had a lot of people whose families came from Chabad going back in generations, and they felt connected to Chabad. But in terms of the organizational power and all that, you know, it's nothing what we look at right now. I had a conversation with somebody who was there at the time as a child, and he described to me, he said, when the Rebbe would speak in 770, it wasn't the huge shul, of course, that many people know nowadays from the pictures. It was one of the small rooms upstairs, which is really probably about the size of my dining room right here, not very big at all. And when the Rebbe would speak, the yeshiva boys would be on the left side, and the adults were on the right side, and the children were on the table in front of him. And I said, the table? He said, yeah. He said, you know, at that time, there were so few children. There were maybe a dozen children sitting around the table. And so it's really, really remarkable, because you'll see the theme, the underlying ideas that the Rebbe was discussing in those early years of 1950 and 51 were still about really impacting the entire world, even though the Rebbe was speaking to 60, 70, 80 people, you know, including a dozen children. So that itself is remarkable, and it's a full conversation for a different time. But this mimer, because it was the mimer that the previous Rebbe chose for the day that he ended up passing away, is considered the previous Rebbe's last will and testament. And it's considered to be a bridge to his son-in-law. And it is very, very much a mission statement for us in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. When people ask the question, why does Chabad not anoint another Rebbe? Well, I believe that you'll understand that a little bit more after you understand what the previous Rebbe says in this mimer. The previous Rebbe was also, interestingly enough, he was alluding to things. The last several months of his life, he began to sign his name, instead of writing his name in script like he always did all of his life, but he began writing the Yud of his name in Torah script. So it ended up being a larger Yud. And why he never told anybody, but the fact of the matter is he passed away on Yud Shvat. And so there are fascinating things like this that were going on that people afterwards were able to understand. There's no question whatsoever that this mimer and the Rebbe really, really, really made it into a focus of his leadership. Who are we? What are we trying to accomplish? What's going on? A lot of critical ideas in terms of our lives can be understood and absorbed from this mimer. So that's a little bit of the history. So it begins with the pasuk from Shir HaShirim, from Song of Songs. I've come into my garden, my sister, my bride. And now in general, Shir HaShirim is really, really interesting because it's looked at, of course, ostensibly as a love poem, but it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you actually read it inside, there's a constant change of context and of tenses, male to female, and even in one verse it changes back and forth. It's very, very, very difficult to understand at face value. But at the same time, Rabbi Akiva says the greatest, the holy of holies is Shir HaShirim. The greatest of secrets can be found in Shir Hashirim because of all these subtleties, because of all these very, very strange comments. And here we have this statement, I have come into my garden. So the Medrash explains that this is not to be taken at face value. Shir Hashirim is a metaphor describing the ongoing relationship between God and his bride, the Jewish people. And of course, we described this concept before in Lgani, that there's a relationship between us, that we are God's bride, so to speak. And he continues and he says the above verse, for example, refers to the time of the construction of the sanctuary, when the Shekhinah came into his garden, for it was then that the divine presence, distance for a time, was again revealed in this world. And that's what we're going to discuss. The Hebrew word Lgani, Bati Lgani, to my garden, is now discussed. Medrash Rabbah on the above verse observes that the word used is not Lgan, I have come to a garden, I've come to the garden, but Lgani, which is my garden. And so this implies Lignuni, which means my bridal chamber. Or as the commentaries on the Medrash explain, this possessive form implies a private place, such as the chamber in which the spiritual union of groom and bride is consummated. Of course, like we said, spoke about Lechadodi. The divine presence is thus saying, I've come into my bridal chamber, into the place in which my essence was originally revealed. So this is a critical idea. What exactly is going on here? We're talking about God coming into the Beit HaMikdash, and God saying this is the place where the ultimate union happens between the Jewish people and God. And the Medrash continues and says, in the beginning, in other words, in the actual creation, the essence of the Shekhinah was apparent in this lowly world. In other words, the way the world was created in the first place was not in such a way where we have nowadays an experience where we feel physicality, we feel our sense of self, we recognize evil, and sometimes we struggle with evil, sometimes we can't even recognize evil. All these feelings were the result of what happened afterwards. When Hashem originally created the world itself expressed and felt godliness. However, the Rebbe continues, in the wake of the cosmic sin of the tree of knowledge, the Shekhinah departed from the earth and rose into the heavens. So what happened, practically speaking, was Chava, Eve, it says that she saw the fruit and saw that it was goodly of appearance. She desired it. She moved away from an experience of recognizing everything as godliness, and she went into a space of selfishness. And that sense of self brings her, of course, to eat of the fruit and to give to her husband, and that brings all this negativity. And God, who originally was revealed in the world and totally comfortable in a way of a home and in a way of a bridal chamber, so to speak, God says, I can't be here. And there's a movement of godliness upwards. God retreats from the world. I can't be revealed here because there's this distance that's created by this sense of self. The Medrash continues and says, later, on account of the sin of Cain, and then of Enosh, the Shekhinah withdrew even further from the world, rising from the nearest heaven to the second and then to the third. Later yet, the sins of the generations of the deluge, the Mabul, caused it to recede from the third heaven to the fourth, and so on. And this progressive recession of the revealed divine presence is alluded to in the wording of the verse that relates to that Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, heard the sound of God walking about in the garden. Mitalech b'toch hagan. What does mitalech mean? So Rabbi Abba notes that the verse does not use the expected form of the verb mehalech, but rather mithalech, which suggests that they heard the divine presence springing back in successive stages of withdrawal. the words kafitz ve'azel, jumps and going forward, going away, leaving. So the Medrash proceeds to explain that after the sins of 7 generations had ceased, the divine presence to after the sins of 7 generations had caused the divine presence to withdraw 7 spiritual levels from its initial manifestation in the world. 7 tzaddikim arose whose divine service drew the divine presence down once more in the world. First one was Avram. Through the merit of Avram, the Shekhinah was brought from the 7th heaven to the 6th. Well, let's talk about Avram because he was the first. What was unique about Avram? Avram was known as Ivri. Ivri means the other side. He's on the other side of the river. But he was also on the other side of all of society. All of society believed in idolatry. What's idolatry?
Okay. Yeah.
Oops. Right? Idolatry is the recognition of powers that exist. So for me personally, I knew this concept. The Rambam describes it quite clearly that first the people of Enosh, their sin was specifically Enosh, thought that, okay, we need to appreciate the fact that the sun and the moon and the stars, we discussed this in one of the previous Maimarim, they give us a sustenance by creating things in the world and the nutrition that comes from the sun and all that. So therefore we need to thank the sun. We need to thank the stars. We need to thank the moon. That was the approach that the original idolaters had. And of course, it was completely inappropriate because all of those things don't exist by themselves. Their existence comes from God. So this is something that, okay, I knew that it existed. It was an idea that I knew was there, but I took my family to Mount Rainier. We lived in Seattle, and Seattle, of course, is surrounded by the Cascade Mountains on one side, the Olympics on the other. It's a spectacular city when the sun is out on those rare occasions. And we go to Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier is 14,410 feet tall. It has a vertical rise above everything around it that's absolutely astounding. It's an active volcano. I'm not smoking on a daily basis, but there's a tremendous amount of movement on it on a constant basis. And you can drive up to an area, spectacular snowfield called Paradise. And it's just really, really, it's called Paradise because it's really just the beauty is astounding. And you're there at 5,000-6,000 feet up on the mountain, and you can see the caldera off in the distance. And knowing this information about the volcano and the power of the volcano, it's just a feeling of awesomeness, of power that's around you. And suddenly I had this little thought in my mind. Now I understand the native religions. As a city slicker, you don't really understand these things because you're just, you're going to the store, you're getting your food, you're coming home, and that's that. Everything you have has been already canned and boxed and is just waiting for you. But when you're under the power of something like this, you can understand where they were coming from. And that exact realization of the logical understanding of the native powers gives you the depth of understanding and the greatness of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu is described by the Rambam as being absolutely brilliant. What's his brilliance? His brilliance was to take a pebble and look up at this 14,400 foot volcano and say these are the same thing. It's just a matter of scale. His recognition that the truth of the matter is that all of these things are themselves individual creations, despite the fact that they have such awesome power, against the logic of everybody else out there against the society of everybody out there is something that is really, really, truly brilliant. His capability of being able to go against the grain and come to this conclusion is really, really something that's remarkable. The Hawaiians, for example, they consider the ocean to be their god. Why? Because that their entire life is dependent upon the ocean. Life comes from the ocean because the fish that they fish, and that's what they eat. And death comes from the ocean because of tidal waves or ships getting wrecked or anything like that. And so that's what they looked at. But for Avram Avinu says the water in this cup is the same thing as the ocean. Just the ocean is so much bigger. And so for him to understand that scale is really incredible. Now, Avram Avinu did not suffice with just thinking about this idea. He knew that he had to change the world, and he went out and started talking to people about it and explaining to people, you are being misled. You need to realize that nature is but a creation. And therefore, he brought the Shekhinah down one lower level because of the fact that he went out and began to bring an awareness of godliness back into the world. And so he was the critical move to be able to draw the Shekhinah, to be able to bring God back into this world. And it continues, and he says through the merit of Yitzchak, the Shekhinah was brought down from the 6th heaven to the 5th, and so on until Moshe, the 7th of these tzaddikim, and the previous Rebbe adds, and all those who are the 7th are cherished, drew the revelation of the Shekhinah down once again into this world below. And this is really, really interesting because the fact that the previous Rebbe was the 6th in the chain of Chabad leaders, and the previous Rebbe is writing this and noting that there's a 7th, and the job of the 7th is the same job as that of Moshe, who is to draw the revelation down into the world, and that is done. Divinity was primarily in the Beit HaMikdash or in the Mishkan. Moshe, of course, built the Mishkan, and he says the word primarily because of the fact that Moshe started this process with the revelation at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, Hashem says, "Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai." Hashem came down into Mount Sinai. What does that mean? Hashem came down into Mount Sinai? That is a revelation on Mount Sinai that Hashem says, you know, the world is going to be able to handle me once again. Unfortunately, of course, through the sin of the golden calf, you know, things went awry once again. But we're not going to dwell on that. But the pasuk says, "V'shachanti v'asuli mikdash v'shachanti bitocham," and they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell within them. Not I will dwell within it, but I will dwell within them. And the Chachamim say, as we say right over here, significantly, the last Hebrew word of the verse is not as expected, bitocho, which means within it, within the Mishkan, within the Beit HaMikdash, within the sanctuary, but bitocham, which means within them, because God craves a dwelling place within each individual Jew. And the Rebbe continues and he says, this concept can grant us an insight into the verse, the righteous will inherit the land and dwell forever upon it. Now the word here is la'ad, translated forever. And that recalls the word ad in the phrase, he who dwells forever, shochen ad marom v'kadosh. So our verse then, we're going to have to stop over here because this is quite we're not even done with the first chapter, but that's okay. May it be thus understood as follows. The righteous will inherit the land, which is an allusion to Gan Eden, because they cause he who dwells forever, shochen ad, to dwell instead of just up there, but to dwell and be revealed in the physical world below. With this in mind, namely the revelation of the divine presence in the sanctuary, and more particularly the revelation of divine dimension within himself, within each individual secures through this construction of his personal sanctuary, we can better understand the interpretation of the verse, Bati Lgani, Lignuni, I've come into my garden, my bridal chamber, the Shekhinah, speaking of its return to the original location of its essential abode in the midst of the nether beings. we are going to understand as a result of this whole idea that there's two concepts that are attached to each other. On the one hand, there's the revelation of God within the world at large, and that physicality should once again express godliness. And then, just as important and an essential part of this process is the revelation of godliness within oneself, where one takes a person's own self and makes themselves into a godly being. And that they refine themselves, they take their animalistic self, their animalistic desires, and they focus them towards godliness. They create a dwelling place for God. They create a bridal chamber, so to speak, with God. They create a union of God with his world. This is the ultimate purpose, as we're going to discuss, of all of creation. And this is the ultimate purpose of our world. In 1950, when this was being said, the industrial revolution had moved on to the nuclear age, and there was the beginnings of an explosion, a massive explosion, of course, of technology and of capability, of richness, wealth across the world that we have nowadays. And the purpose of it all is not just for the wealth per se, but for the purpose of finding godliness within it, of the world itself expressing godliness. And that is the mission statement of the world at large. And that is very much, as we're going to see, that's the mission statement of every single one of us. So we're going to continue this on Friday, and I hope we'll make some headway. But this is very much speaks to who we are. It speaks to why Chabad continues, because we have a very, very clear mission statement. We know exactly who we are, and we know exactly what we need to do. And that's going to be the subject of this mimer.